Well, welcome everyone. Hello. Welcome all from the UK and internationally to this, the second plenary of the Health Services Research UK conference. We had our first plenary this morning, and if you joined us for that, chaired by Julie Smith, you'll know we set a really high bar. And I'm delighted to welcome lots of people to this plenary, over 3,000 people who've registered for the conference as a whole. Most of those are from the UK, but many from other countries. I think we've got people from over 40 different countries joining us over these 3 days. And of course, many of whom will never have been to a previous HSRUK conference, so a particular welcome to them. I'm Kieran Walshe, I'm chair of HSRUK, and I'm a professor of health policy and management at the University of Manchester. I'm going to provide a bit of introduction and context for today's plenary, this afternoon's plenary, and explain how the session will work and how you can get involved. And the plenary will last for 60 minutes to 3 p.m. British Summer Time. As I said, this is the second of 6 plenaries. We have 2 more tomorrow and 2 more on Friday. I really hope you'll join us for some of those and engage in the online discussion. If you've registered for the conference, you should already have had invites to all 6 plenaries, and you'll get reminders now before each plenary starts. Also, over the last 2 weeks, we've been posting on the HSRUK conference website recordings of all the conference papers, oral presentations, posters, workshops, which we'd accepted. And these have had several thousand views already, which is just fantastic, but do go and take a look. That content is all on our website at hsruk.org. I want to say a few thanks just before we start the session to those who've made this conference happen, because normally it's a face-to-face event. It's gone entirely virtual and online, and that has been an extraordinary effort by lots of people. So thanks to our speakers and our presenters and session organisers who've taken that big leap with us. Particular thanks to the conference committee and to the conference team, and a particular thank you to Helen Matiane, who's our executive officer, and Alison Notley from Eventage, our conference company, who have really gone above and beyond in making this conference happen. Also, particular thanks to the Health Foundation and the Nuffield Trust, both of whom play a big part in our conference and support Health Services Research UK across the year. So turning to the session and the focus on evidence-based management and what it means to managers, I can't resist beginning with the pandemic. How can I not? And the way in which research and evidence have just taken centre stage. Never before have I seen so many professors of epidemiology, social psychology, public health and so on in the media, on TV, in the newspapers, and standing alongside ministers and civil servants. The way science and evidence is used in making public policy decisions about how to manage the pandemic, how to reconcile public health versus social and economic concerns about the pandemic, it's become a real focus for debate. And populist political leaders, naming no names, who not so long ago were declaring that the public had had enough of experts, have perhaps had quite a hard lesson in what happens when their rhetoric comes up against a virus and a kind of epidemiological reality. But all of this, I think, should be seen in the context of a long-standing and sometimes quite fractious debate about the role of research and evidence in decision-making in all sorts of domains, in public policy, but also in education, in criminal justice, in housing, in welfare, and of course, in health and social care. Researchers and practitioners sometimes seem to inhabit parallel universes, speak different languages, work to different timescales, and many of you, and certainly many amongst our speakers and contributors to this conference, spend at least some of our time trying to broker or trying to span those two worlds. So for our session today, I'm delighted to have 2 really great speakers who are going to share their insights and get us to think about this issue of how evidence works for managers. Rob Briner, who's going to be our first speaker, has been for some years one of the leading advocates of evidence-based management in the UK and internationally, and a persistent critic, I think it's fair to say, of the way managers and leaders fall for fads and fashions in management decision-making, particularly in his own field of human resource management and human relations. He's a professor of organisational psychology at Queen Mary University, London, and he's the scientific director of the Centre for Evidence-Based Management. Now, our second speaker is Dr. Louella Vaughan, who's a practicing acute physician at the Royal London Hospital and also a clinical academic whose work has focused on acute medicine, risk stratification and quality improvement, and also a senior research fellow at the Nuffield Trust, where her more policy-focused work focuses on emergency and unscheduled care. So During the presentation, you're going to have the opportunity to listen to the speakers, but also to think about and ask the questions that you would like to pick up in the discussion following their two presentations. And you can see on screen there the way this is going to work. At the bottom of your screen, if you hover at the bottom, you get a Q&A button, and when you click on it, you get this box appearing, and you can use that to type in a question to ask, and press send to submit that question. You can also see all the questions other people are asking. I really encourage you to use the thumbs up icon to like the questions that you'd really like to see addressed, so that I and our moderators can see which questions are more popular or more pressing, and which ones we should try and pick up with the speakers and the panel. So that's all from me. I think it's going to be a fantastic session. I'm going to hand over now first to Rob, and Rob will then hand over to Louella, and then we will come back to all three of us and you for a really fruitful discussion. So Rob, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Kieran, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm delighted to be here, particularly to talk about the role of evidence in management and how managers may feel about evidence. And particularly, one of my concluding points will be, I think many of us who are interested in healthcare, I think also expect the frontline practitioners in healthcare organisations to themselves as individual professionals be evidence-based in their approach. And one of the things I'm going to conclude with is actually talking about how I think unless organisations are managed in an evidence-based way, it's very difficult for those frontline workers themselves to be evidence-based, not least because, for example, they're given perverse incentives to hit certain targets, which in the end are more about other things than actually helping, in this case, patients. But I'll come back to that at the end. So my starting point for this is, and I'm trying to advance the slide, it seems to not be advancing. Do I have control? So I just have to say next slide, please, because it doesn't seem to be moving. Thank you. So my assumption, which is, I guess, perhaps a strange one, and it seems like an obvious one, is that leaders and managers, including, as Kieran mentioned, maybe political leaders, should try and do stuff that addresses important organisational business problems, not trivial stuff, and do stuff that's more likely to work, not stuff that's unlikely to work. Now, this sounds like a statement of the obvious, but what is quite striking just from general observation is often that leaders and managers don't do that, not because they can't, but because things get in the way, because other things kind of stop them from doing it in different sorts of ways. But if you broadly agree that people should focus, leaders should focus on important stuff and stuff that's more likely to work, the question arises, how are they going to do that? How is that going to happen? And I think the answer to that question is something like evidence-based practice, or in this context, evidence-based management. Next slide, please. So where does the idea of evidence-based practice come from? Next slide, please. So the basic elevator pitch here is that decisions about important problems and solutions should be based on the best available evidence. That evidence in management means any relevant data and information, including scientific findings, organizational data, professional expertise, and stakeholder concerns. So in management, as in other fields that use evidence-based practice, there are multiple sources of evidence. And the key point here is that all practitioners use evidence in their decisions, but tend to pay limited attention to the quality and the relevance of that evidence, but also use limited sources and types of evidence. So in other words, we always use evidence, but that is not the same as an evidence-based approach. And that's a really crucial point. Next slide, please. So where did evidence-based practice come from? Yes, it's a thing in multiple fields. And these are roughly the dates to which these different fields have adopted or decided to say they're going to be into evidence-based practice in different ways. So you can see it started very early on in medicine and has gone through these different fields and many others roughly at these dates. Next slide, please. Many of these centres many of these fields have centres which try and promote the use of evidence-based practice in those fields. So on this slide, we can see policing, we can see policy making, medicine and conservation. Next slide, please. And we can also see education, social work, aged care, and so forth. So it's been around for a while in many fields. Next slide, please. And 10 years ago, we established a Centre for Evidence-Based Management to try and do for management what those other fields, other centres have done for those fields. Next slide, please. And this is the book that came out of the centre a couple of years ago, again, having the same purpose to promote evidence-based practice in management. Next slide, please. And this is CIPD. So Kieran mentioned one of my field specific areas of interest in management is human resource management. CIPD is the professional body for HR professionals in the UK and elsewhere. And this is just an example. They've recently got quite into evidence-based practice, and this is just an example of resources on their web pages for their members to try and become better at doing evidence-based practice in human resource management in this case. Next slide, please. So what is evidence-based practice? Next slide, please. So this is not my definition or the Centre for Evidence-Based Management definition. I think many of you may recognise this from medicine and other fields that have adopted evidence-based practice. So it's a conscientious, explicit and judicious use of the best available evidence from multiple sources to increase the likelihood of a favourable outcome. So it's about a process. It's not about certainties. It's about probabilities and likelihoods. And my sense is that anybody practicing evidence-based practice, the best thing they can do is to reduce uncertainty. So the strongest claim you could ever make is that given our understanding of this problem and this context, doing this is more likely to get to the outcome we want than doing this or doing nothing. So it's not, to me, evidence-based practice is not something that makes huge, strong claims, but it's about probabilities and likelihoods. Next slide, please. I'm going to make this bigger in a second. This is an infographic that was actually produced by CIPD, I just mentioned, and the Centre for Evidence-Based Management, which tries to set out a way of thinking about the process of evidence-based practice, in this case in human resource management, but could apply to many fields, including management in general. So the idea is you'd use something like this, both to first identify a problem or opportunity, and if you found one, and only if you found one, you would then use it to identify a possible solution or intervention. Next slide, please. So you can see there's the 4 sources of evidence that I mentioned already. There's a definition I mentioned. Next slide, please. And here are the 6 steps. So you ask a question, you pull together information, you critically appraise it, you aggregate it, you apply it, and you assess it to increase the likelihood of a favourable outcome. Now this has 6 steps. It has 4 sources, but it's the principles that are important, which I'll come on to in a minute, but it's about multiple sources and it's about a structured approach. Suppose you only have 3 sources, well, that's probably fine. Suppose you only go along a number of these steps, that's probably okay as well. But the point is multiple sources and having a structured approach. Next slide, please. So now I want to give you an example. I think many of you have probably heard of employee engagement. Next slide, please. This is probably one of the most popular, I guess, well, it has been probably the last 10 or 15 years, popular ideas in human resource management in particular, but also specifically, I guess, in lots of organizations about trying to increase motivation, retention, performance, those sorts of things. And there is a plethora of books around, popular books around how to do employee engagement. So I'm just using this as an example to give you a sense of the kinds of questions, if we were in a sort of senior management team or human resource management team, we were trying to get a grip on an employee engagement problem. Next slide, please. So supposing some time ago, your organization, again, if you work in the UK and you've linked to healthcare, many healthcare organizations do this already, but supposing some time ago, an organization decided, we don't know why, to measure engagement in a survey at regular intervals. So the senior management team believe that low engagement as measured in this survey is kind of a problem. And because it's low engagement is a sort of problem, you should attempt to somehow increase low engagement. How would you approach that problem and identify a potential solution from an evidence-based practice approach? Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, in these 4 sources of evidence, I'm going to give examples of the questions. I'm not going to go into all 4 areas. I'll just probably talk about a couple, but just to give you a feel for the sorts of questions you would ask, not necessarily the answers you would find, but the kind of questions you should ideally ask. And these are in no particular order. So next slide, please. Firstly, you look at your own expertise as a practitioner, as a manager, as a leader, as an HR professional, and you ask these questions first about identifying the problem. Have we seen these employee engagement problems before? Based on our experience, is this level of engagement a problem somehow? And if you believe it is, then you ask other questions about a solution. Have we seen these solutions before? Do they work? What happened? And so forth. And again, you always ask in every case, of course, how relevant, applicable, and trustworthy is our expertise around this problem. Next slide, please. So this is the second area of evidence, organizational data. Again, you first think about the problem. What actually is the engagement level? Are our measures of engagement valid and reliable? Do data, organizational data, show how and if low engagement is causing problems? So for example, can you pick out a trend such that when engagement goes up, for example, performance goes up, or when engagement goes down, errors increased or something like that? Can you actually see how it's a problem? And if you can identify a problem. Again, what do organisational data tell you about potential solution? But also, again, how relevant, applicable and trustworthy are our organisational data. So that's the second area. Cover the next slide, please. Next slide, please. And you do the same for scientific literature. Next slide, please. And you also do the same for stakeholders, which again, typically in management might be employees, customers, clients, service users, senior managers, etc. Next slide, please. So that's to just give you an idea of the kinds of questions you'd ask for that particular problem if you're approaching it from an evidence-based management perspective. Now, one, I think, real sticking point here is that a lot of organisations feel they're already doing evidence-based management. They always feel they're doing it. So typically, about every 6 months, I send out something on LinkedIn, on Twitter, saying, is anybody doing evidence-based management? It doesn't mean they would necessarily tell me or anything, but I just always ask people. And I always get some responses saying, yes, we are. So we go through the infographic, and typically people are doing a bit of it, like they might be using organizational data, but they're not looking at other sources, or they might be not taking a structured approach, or they might be doing it to identify solutions, but not to identify problems. So people are always using evidence. So what's the next slide, please? So what are the key differences between evidence-based practice or evidence-based management and what we already do? And I think this is an incredibly important point, because I think so everybody feels they're already doing. I think there's three main differences. The first is the approach to evidence. And by that, I mean conscientious, explicit, and judicious. So those three things together, I think, is like a package, a way of thinking about how you approach thinking about and doing and collecting evidence. Conscientious, explicit, judicious. The second difference, I think, between evidence-based practice and what we already do is multiple sources. And this is for two reasons, both to triangulate and cross-check to see if you're getting the same or different evidence picture across these four sources, but it's also to contextualize and make sense and better use of evidence from other sources. So for example, there may be what are in some senses a very good, valid, reliable set of scientific evidence about something, but you need evidence from the other sources to know if it makes any sense and will be applicable in your context. So multiple sources is very important for those reasons. The third main difference, I think, is this structural stepped approach, as I mentioned already. So it's about getting evidence for potential problems or opportunities first, and only then thinking about evidence for possible solutions, because we're easily distracted and pushed off course, and there are many obstacles, which I'll talk about in a minute. Next slide, please. So how evidence-based is management in HR? Having seen this example, you may have your own views about that. I'm going to talk about three indicators. So barriers, management training, and the popularity and proliferation of management and HR fads. And talk about those as indicators that maybe management is not particularly evidence-based at the moment. Next slide, please. So what are the barriers? There's numerous. These are just some examples. The first is misconceptions. I've already talked about one. We're doing it already. So I think that's a barrier. I think another barrier is organizational politics and power. There are often vested interest in terms of managers and leaders around things like vested interest, empire building, things that get in the way. People maybe won't want to do evidence-based practice. I think there's also largely an examined belief that in general, management is usually quite good. My sense is amongst management and leadership in general, is it broadly speaking, it thinks it's okay. Well, is it, isn't it? It's hard to know, but it's generally pretty unexamined. Leaders and managers tend to think they're doing an okay job unless they really screw something up. And even then, there may be someone else to blame for that, at least in their minds. Another barrier is what are managers and leaders actually rewarded for? It seems to me that managers are often rewarded for activity, doing stuff, rolling things out, bringing about change, transforming stuff, not necessarily doing what's important or effective. Another barrier related to that is career incentives. How do managers and leaders get to those positions of seniority? Do they get there by being evidence-based leaders or managers? I'm not so sure. They get there for other reasons, such as wanting to and being good at politics, for example. Another barrier is that just few evaluations of decisions or the outcomes of decisions unless there's a disaster. So in a context where your actions are not really evaluated or they're hard to evaluate, again, maybe evidence-based practice doesn't really seem very relevant. And in the end, perhaps, who really wants evidence-based management? Where is the demand for this? And sometimes that's quite hard to see. Next slide, please. Apart from the demand, the lack of demand may be a lack of supply. It seems to me that management, leadership and education is not focused on evidence-based practice skills. So is there much evidence-based practice education in management schools? Really not very much. Do senior leaders have trained decision-making? In my limited experience, hardly ever, even though that's one of the most important things they do. Are they trained in analysing, critically evaluating various kinds of information evidence? Maybe a little, but maybe not so much. Next slide, please. And the third indicator is fads and fashions. And you can see this is an attempt to try and look at fads and fashions across various organisations. You can see, for example, they come in and out, like management by objectives, comes in, then kind of disappears. Empowerment comes in and kind of disappears. 1 minute manager comes in and disappears. And those of you who've been around organisations for a while have probably seen some of these actually come and go. Next slide, please. And as again, with many fads and fashions, you can see they're accompanied by very popular, often best-selling management books, which really inspire leaders and organisations to take on these ideas and try and implement them. Next slide, please. So how can you spot a management fad? Well, there's a few ways of doing it. First, it's buzzy and exciting. It makes very big claims, often no good quality supporting evidence. It often involves management gurus and sometimes academic superstars. It's all good, there's no downside. It's universal panacea, it will fix every problem. And it often uses unverifiable anecdotes and success stories, usually from big, well-known companies and organizations whose success is attributed to the fad with no good evidence. A classic example of our time might be something like Google. Google do this, Google is successful, therefore if we do this, we'll be successful too. And they often seem to involve new words which don't actually describe anything new, like metrics instead of measures, analytics instead of analysis, big data instead of data, etc. So there's some ways of spotting it. Next slide, please. These are examples of practices that seem to me often to be implemented apparently in the absence of an evidence-based practice process. This is not about whether these work or not, but they're just done as a kind of routine. So for example, performance appraisals, employee engagement, management development, 360-degree feedback, centralizing, decentralizing, centralizing, decentralizing, and also restructuring in general. It's just done without much, as far as I consideration, for what the problem is and what the best intervention might be. For example, a recent one, unconscious bias training, plus other D&I practices, and also personality typing and profiling. Next slide, please. This is just an example actually from a UK NHS trust, and this is publicly available stuff. This is an example, some of you may recognize, of a personality profiling tool, which puts people into types, yellow, red, blue, green, etc. Next slide, please. And these are quotes from somebody who's involved in trying to use this tool to help shape teams within an NHS hospital and also with a trust. So this is, so the trust now knows exactly what its composition of clinical teams in 40% lead with a caring, sensitive, green energy, etc. And the next bullet point talks about we want more people who are technical, who will get tasks done, and using this tool to recruit for specific colours. For instance, our pharmacy team mostly leads with a blue energy. They have no reds to ensure projects stick to timescales. We use this information to identify needs for hiring someone with the more red-like qualities. And this is just, it's not particularly picking this out for criticism, it's just a microcosmic example of some of the challenges of the tools people may use in all kinds of management contexts that may be of quite limited value, or it's very unclear if they're of value. Next slide, please. So, evidence-based management, I think, is always important in many contexts. And of course, I'm biased about it, but I think there are some settings, some contexts where it's even more important. I think in a context of a very sort of wealthy, rich company who's got lots of resources to spare, where their market's fairly secure, where their income's pretty secure, they're growing effortlessly, I don't think evidence-based management matters very much. You can just do whatever you like. It doesn't really matter. Next slide, please. But I think there's some contexts where it does, where it's more important. So I think when the performance of staff has consequences for individuals, families and communities and society, it's when it really matters how staff and how that organisation perform. Evidence-based management is even more important. I think where ethical behaviour is important. I think where we're spending the public's money, where individuals are being held accountable for decisions. Where money is tight, we can't waste resources throwing ineffective non-solutions onto vague, ill non-defined problems. We're trying to do more with less and not waste resources. It's more important then. I think also when there's better things to spend money on than management and HR, you have to demonstrate how management and HR is making a difference. Also, as I mentioned right at the start, when frontline staff are themselves expected to do evidence-based practice, you can't manage in ways that are not consistent with that, because those staff need to be supported to do the things that are most important for clients and customers and service users, and the things that are more likely to work, not things you as a manager organisation think are important. That's a different issue. So I think it's particularly important in, for example, healthcare organisations. Next slide, please. What is management if it's not evidence-based? So you could argue if managers and leaders are not being evidence-based, what are they doing? Next slide, please. And these are some examples drawing on Isaacs and Fitzgerald. Some of you may know this articles. So what are the alternatives to evidence-based management? I won't go into all of these. Eminence-based management, for example, obedience-based management, indolence-based management, indulgence-based management, reverence-based management. So I think one of the issues is if managers these are not being evidence-based, it's important to instead start thinking about what are they doing instead, because understanding that might be an important way of trying to become more evidence-based. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, what evidence-based management is and is not. It is about making better informed, not perfect decisions. It is not about uncritically dismissing or accepting evidence, data, and information. It is not about proof or truth or prioritizing scientific findings. It is simply, and it's complicated too, but it's simply about trying to do stuff that addresses important business organizational problems and do stuff that is more likely to work. And in the end, that's what its purpose is, as far as I can see, in any field. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. So I'm been increasingly interested in this particular topic about how well is evidence used in the NHS. And as a clinician, my initial interest in this was around the application of clinical evidence. But over the course of the research that I've been doing, what I have found is that it's not so much the evidence itself, it's its translation into organisational and then managerial context, which actually become really important with the evidence. And so I thought that I would have a look at the issue of how well is evidence used in the NHS. And at first glance, it would appear that evidence is extremely well assessed and then care is scrutinised in the NHS, I would argue, more than almost any other country. And in fact, one could go so far as to say that the NHS is absolutely obsessed by the issue of the quality of the evidence. And well, why do I say that? Well, because the NHS is fairly unique in having a whole series of organisations which are set up to scrutinise evidence. And this includes organisations like NICE, HQIP, which oversees national audit. NHSE&I in themselves are supposed to be recommending changes to care which are evidence-based. And then we have the Royal Colleges and all sorts of other organisations producing standards and guidelines. And one of the things that I have found from a clinical aspect particularly interesting about this is that over the years, this has shifted not just from what do the research studies say about clinical choices, but how do we organise and deliver care, particularly within sets of units of care. So, for example, NICE and HQIP and National Audit have looked at things like how should things function within a stroke unit? How should we set up and organise acute care systems? What should these look like? How should these function? And on the other hand, we have a whole series of organisations which are given over to this. Oh, I don't know what happened there. To the scrutiny of the care that's delivered. And so, for example, the Care Quality Commission, which looks at all NHS organisations, including general practice and care homes, has within its scope managerial and leadership issues, issues such as bullying, and also about how the care is set up and delivered within the context of the hospital, getting it right first time. And again, the colleges will increasingly come in and look at organisations and look at how the care is organised and delivered. So one could say that actually organisational evidence in the UK, evidence around organisation, is taken very seriously. But I'd like to have a look at a few clinical examples. And it's important to say that these examples have not been chosen because they're egregious or they're a particular problem, but firstly because they act at different levels. So one is a piece of national policy which has affected regional structures. The other is a piece of national policy which affects individual hospitals. And then I've got an interesting example at the end, which is about internal hospital politics and how things are managed within hospitals. And so they're not chosen because they're egregious, but because they're the type of examples with which people are familiar, and because they typify certain types of problems, I think, within the NHS. So the first of these is to look at issues surrounding the organisation and delivery of stroke care. Now, the first thing to say is that the stroke care delivered within the UK has improved vastly over the last few years. And much of the driver for this has rested with the National Stroke Audit Program, which is an exceptional program in itself. The Stroke Audit Program looks at every single patient in the UK who was admitted to a stroke unit with a stroke. Data is entered and uploaded at hospital level and individual patient level. It is correlated with outcomes. There is a standard spine of questions which are asked each year. But then there are additional questions asked about certain types of things. These are correlated with outcomes, and then these are fed back into next year's guidelines so that practice should improve. And this is a lovely example of high-scale audit driving quality of care. So let me say that this is an exceptional piece of work. And on the left-hand graph on the screen, what you can see is that over the course of this program running, that stroke mortality at 30 days has improved substantially over time. And one of the things that came out of the stroke audit was this relationship between the improvement in stroke outcomes and the number of patients treated at each stroke centre. And this led, so that is in itself is well evidenced, but this then led to a leap of faith which says that, well, if there is a correlation between the number of patients treated and the outcomes, then if we make all of the units in which patients are treated bigger, then this should further drive outcomes. And this led to a piece of national policy which said that stroke units should be reconfigured across the UK. And this was done, first of all, in 2 regions. It was done in London, and then at a slightly later stage, it was followed up in Manchester. And what's surprising about this was that the outcomes that were expected did not flow. And so if you look at the results, there was a significant decline, but it wasn't in raw mortality, it was in risk-adjusted mortality. And it wasn't out until 90 days that you really started to see genuine patient. Sorry, we've just skipped a slide. I don't know what, anyway, I shall carry on. And these improvements were only for London. There was no improvement at all in mortality for Manchester. Well, what was the reason for that? Well, Naomi Fullett's, next slide, thank you. I'm not sure what's, no, back. Sorry, the slides have just gone completely haywire. Back. Okay, sorry. So Naomi Fullett and her group did a lovely piece of work, which tried to get underneath why Manchester did not see the improvements in mortality that had actually been expected. And actually what they found was that it wasn't the clinical decision making that was the problem, it was the way in which the change had been implemented, organised and then managed, which was the issue. So this is quite a nice example where you have some clear clinical evidence, but it's not translated into better patient outcomes because of issues around organisation and management within the NHS. Next slide. So I'm an acute physician, and so I'm particularly interested in changes to acute services. So next slide. So NHS England and NHS Improvement have been running something called the Same Day Emergency Care National Programme. And one of the things that they're particularly interested in is reducing the level of attendances at the emergency department. And this is predicated on the assumption that if we shift care out of the emergency department into other structures within the hospital, this will allow hospitals to better meet the 4-hour target. And it's important to note that the 4-hour target is still the only thing that counts when it comes to assessing the quality of acute and emergency care in England. That is worth reiterating. Despite all of the other targets and all of the other standards, it is the 4-hour target that counts. So the rationale is that if you have other units, other places in the hospital which do similar sorts of things to the ED, that are more tailored towards patient need, then this will improve the 4-hour target and it will deliver better patient care. And so there is now something called the same-day emergency care program, and the types of units which hospitals are expected to set up are an acute medical or ambulatory care day unit, a surgical day unit, and now also an acute frailty service. The other place where EDs are expected to offload or stream to is to general practice type areas within the hospital. So this is usually called GP streaming. And this means that if you look at the diagram on the right, what you see is that you have this bricolage of service lines which are all tried to put together to move patients out of the emergency department, offload the emergency department, and allow the emergency department to function better and to hit the 4-hour target. Next slide. But if you start to look at the evidence underneath this, a different picture emerges. So the rationale for this is fine, but let's have a look at the evidence. Well, there is no evidence for same-day emergency care for acute medical illnesses. There's no evidence that it hurts patients, but there's no evidence that it improves any type of outcome. There is no evidence that streaming patients to GP or primary care type services, back a slide please. There's no evidence that this works either. Next slide. And comprehensive geriatric assessment, which forms the nub of acute frailty services, there is some evidence that this is helpful in the hospital setting, but no one has actually gotten underneath the fact of whether it's the CGA, the assessment itself, which produces better patient outcomes, or whether it's the team context in which it's delivered that produces the better outcomes. So there is no evidence that doing a rapid assessment or CGA, which is meant to be a lengthy process which happens in a hospital, can actually be delivered on a same-day basis. So there is no evidence which sits behind each of these individual units. And then you have the much more interesting problem of what happens to your patient flows in a hospital when all of these when the patients are kind of whizzing all over the place. And we did a piece of work a couple of years ago which did not set out to answer this particular question, but was a really interesting side finding of a piece of research we did on small hospitals. So the diagrams that you see are flows through 2 rural hospitals. They're exactly the same size. The hospital on the left-hand side of your screen has a whole series of separate areas. In fact, this hospital, when we totted them up, had 9 separate, not 1, but 9 separate areas that the patients could flow through. And what you see is highly turbulent sets of flow. The hospital on the left-hand side, it had an emergency department, an acute medical unit, and an ambulatory emergency care department. And as you can see, the flows through these are extremely smooth. What is interesting is that when we talk to managers and the managers, the system on the left was almost completely impossible to manage. And the main reason for that is, A, there's lots of different areas. Because of the way they're set up, these areas are geographically dispersed within the hospital. And in fact, at this hospital, they were up to a half a mile apart, some of the parts of the units. And it was impossible to see what was going on in any part of the system at any given point in time. So in fact, something which had been set up with no evidence, I must reiterate, to help with flow in the hospital actually just made the flow worse, and it became impossible to redirect patients through the system. And the hospital on the left, when they abolished this and moved to something that looked more like it did on the right, they went from being middle of the ranks in terms of hitting the 4-hour target to being in the top 10. And I'm not saying that this is cause and effect, but as I said, one of these sets of things, the theory behind it is fine, but the unexpected consequence is that you have no managerial or organisational grip of what's going on. Next one. So this I haven't researched, but this was a really striking finding of the pandemic for me as a researcher. I went back to work full time during the pandemic. Yay me! Clap now. But this was a very, very striking thing. So this is about the hospital, the way that hospitals restructured themselves to deal with the coronavirus. And the idea that sits behind this is something called the pod, which is that each ward is assigned a group of doctors, which will be, next slide, which will be a set of consultants, registrars, and then junior doctors who will cover that ward 24/7. And the idea is that that means you have a constant cohort of people. If someone becomes infected, you know who they've been exposed to. So it makes infection control easy to manage, and it's also supposed to bring some level of support and team working, which is also supposed to be psychologically important, and that's absolutely fine. And so that's what we did at my hospital. That's a sort of rota that you're seeing, and that's a small portion of it because we ended up running 10 medical wards at my hospital during this. And all of this was all run on 12-hour shifts. Next slide. However, when you pick underneath this, what was interesting is that this idea, so this came from one major London teaching hospital. My hospital just picked it up and adopted it, basically dropped what was happening into the, that's the slide that we're missing, dropped it into the middle of our hospital, our trust, which is actually 3 teaching hospitals. But this particular idea in its form from the original London teaching hospital took hold across large portions of the UK. Now with Twitter and email and everybody being very worried about what was happening, everybody was keen to get ideas as quickly as they could. So this was a very widely disseminated idea. And as you can see, it lends itself to interesting complexity about how people work. I won't go into this, but at the top is what the consultants did over a 1 month period, and the bottom is a small example of the complexities around the registrar rotas. Next slide. However, what was interesting about this is, although again, theoretically, and there is some evidence for some of the things that we talked about, such as containing people for evidence control, completely runs counter to everything else that we know about best rostering practice, which is that it has to take into account patient need, staff need, and organisational need. Next slide. More problematic than that, we know that 12-hour shifts are bad for doctors, well, certainly bad for nurses, and there's no reason to believe that they're not bad for doctors. They lead to burnout. They're bad for patients. They increase patient mortality, and I know that Cara Darrell has been speaking at this conference, and the Southampton team who are very interested in this. Next slide. And what's even more interesting is that if you are in a situation which is either physically difficult, like being on a tugboat in high seas, or working in PPE, or where you require high degrees of concentration in order to do your job well, then you need much shorter shifts with tighter rotational times. So not a week at a time, we're talking 6 to 8 hour shifts, rotating every 2 to 3 days, or even every day if that's actually what you need to do. So although there was some nice theory behind this, it doesn't actually go with any the other important evidence which sits around the way that people should be rostered in stressful situations. And certainly this is what happened in our trust. First of all, we couldn't make it work just simply because of the numbers. We have 3 hospitals, all of which are reasonably large, but one hospital has more than double the number of middle grade staff and also consultant staff, despite being not that different in terms of the number of admissions. And certainly for medical admissions, my hospital, which is, I should say, is Hospital C, actually has fewer admissions per day than Hospital A. So there is no equality with the distribution of staff, and we actually ended up having to shift staff from A from C to B and A in order to support this roster, when you think they might want to make do with what they have. The other thing to say is that people very quickly started actually reorganising their rotas in order to suit themselves much better, which meant that, again, managerially, no one could have had any grip on it. So how do we use evidence better in the NHS? Well, I think the first thing to say is the evidence actually any good? Is the evidence actually any good? And it's important to think about and reassess that for the reasons that we've just run through. And where there is no evidence, is there actually counter evidence or something else which might be better or more appropriate, as Rob has talked about? Next slide. Next slide. And I think there's the interesting issue is what we're dealing with in terms of the way that the point of care that we're delivering. Is it factory floor? So is it HIP? Is it surgically orientated when all of the patients are the same, the procedure is the same, and the things that need to be done are the same? Or is it much more bespoke, which might be the rehabilitation of the very confused patient who's just had their hip done, who fell over and fractured their hip because in fact they actually had an infection? And this is very important to think about in the way that the evidence is applied and the way that things are managed within the NHS. Next slide. And I think it's important to think about whether what we're doing is variational innovation. As I said, there are lots of standards which set out there, which are about the organisation and delivery of care. And I think there's 2 aspects. One is what's being proposed in the sets of guidelines? Is it a variation on what is already being done at your organisation, or isn't it an innovation? And these two things have different implications for the organisation. And then the other problem within the NHS is the flip of that, which is that the NHS is very strongly about not invented here, so we're going to do something special that's unique to our organisation. And again, variation is absolutely fine if your organisation needs to do that. If you're generally innovating, that's great. But if you're doing it just because you think that your organisation is different or special, then that may not actually be particularly helpful. So that is already always worth thinking about quite hard. And then we come back to the final point, which Trish Greenhalgh has already made this morning, and Robert did as well, but you can't escape this, is that when it comes to this kind of thing, context is king. And this applies in a whole series of ways. So inevitably, with organisational research, the context in which the research was conducted is not going to be the same as your organisation. There are particular problems in the NHS where policy is rolled out not after a trial, but after a pilot. The pilots are usually not properly assessed, and certainly if you're a pilot site, you consider that you have an obligation to make this work well. And that I don't think is ever taken into account when we consider the context of how these things are supposed to work. And then there's a context of your individual organisation. Now, context can be scary, but in some ways this can be reduced to what is the patient need, and what resource does our organisation have, and how can we match these two things? Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'm done.
That's great. I'm sorry about the slight pregnant pause there, waiting to check whether the video had transferred. And in a moment, I think what would be helpful, Mark, would be if we put Louella and Rob and me all on screen for the Q&A. We've had, I think it's about 30 something, 38. The number keeps going up. Questions from people related to the presentations, and I'm thinking we've got probably about a quarter of an hour left to try and pick up some of those questions. And I'm going to bring the Q&A up, and I'm going to work through the ones that have had, if you like, the most upvotes and focus more on those. But one thing I just wanted to start with both of you, Rob and Louella, is that all three of us have been thinking about this for some time. I think my first publication about evidence-based management was back in 2000. Yeah, that's just age, isn't it? But I'm interested in your views about how much progress we have made. Rob, you signalled the fact that it's the 10-year anniversary of the Centre for Evidence-Based Management this year, and how we avoid our discussion of this, the narrative being a bit of a counsel of despair, and almost a discouraging sense that it's hard for people to change the way in which organisations and organisational leaders use evidence. So Rob, what do you think about that? You've been at this also for quite some time.
Yeah, so yeah, counsel of despair is my middle name. No, it's not, but I think in the context of evidence-based management in particular, I think it's really clear things have changed. Things have changed. How much? I don't know. But for example, it's certainly the case now there are, I think around the world, there's probably about 50 or 60 business schools now that have at least one evidence-based management course in it. So that, and there probably were 10 years ago, there was maybe 2. So there's a few indications there of change. And I think there's some indications of change because it does certainly in management, people, organizations, including HR, are definitely more interested in data and evidence compared to say 20 years ago. They certainly see there's value there. If they're using it very well, that's a different issue. But I think there is certainly more interest in it. And as you mentioned with COVID-19 and the response of governments, broadly speaking, yeah, there's been counteracting forces. One is towards, yes, let's use more evidence and data. And the other thing, as you said, is like, forget the experts, forget the data, let's just do what we think is right. So I think there's these countervailing things, but I think, yeah, it's hard to see much progress. And I think it's not because individuals aren't interested. I think it's the systems and structures in which people have to work. And that's the really hard thing to change. I think as individuals, I think we all get the idea of using evidence to make better decisions. I think everyone gets that. It's not difficult, but we are constrained within our organisations, and that's, I think, the real sticking point.
Louella, what about you? Because one of the points you made was that we have kind of institutionalised evidence-based decision-making clinically through mechanisms like NICE particularly, but also some of the work around Royal Colleges and guidelines. So you mentioned some of the work of HQIP and the national audits, and those are all kind of institutionalising mechanisms. Do you think we've made any progress in the same way around institutionalising the use of evidence by policymakers and senior leaders?
So I think the answer is yes and no. I think the first thing that I was thinking of in terms of the response to Rob is that one of the problems is the expectation around what clinicians are able to do. So the emphasis with regard to clinicians in management and leadership has not been around ops. That went out some time ago, and it's all been about leadership and how you lead a team and all that kind of thing, not how you understand and enact organisational change and what in fact this might mean. The other problem that we've come up against, and we did an interesting piece of work with this around the NHS quality standards, which are almost all organisationally based, is that because they're pressured externally, either from NHS EORI or because you've had a bad CQC visit or something else is happening, it tends to be, we need to do it and we need to do it now, and it doesn't matter what it looks like. And so it tends to be done in a rush, in a hurry, so that you've got something that looks good, instead of the basic tenets of is this what we need? Is this what we want? And then working towards it in a systematic fashion. And certainly some organisations that, in the course of the research that we've been doing at the Trust, is that organisations which have really embedded QI programs, where clinicians are given training, space and time. And when I say clinicians, I don't mean the doctors, I also mean the nursing staff and the managers are included in this, and they come together to do this, then actually those organisations do this kind of stuff really well. But we operate in a system where there's not enough money and there's not enough time, and everybody's under both clinical pressure and managerial pressure. And that means that stuff doesn't get done as well as it ought to. And a lot of the pressure is coming from these external organisations, because hospitals are increasingly accountable. And in some ways that's good, but it doesn't always create the solutions that are needed.
Very presciently, pick up two questions there which have been raised by people. One of them is it easier or harder to do evidence-based practice in organisations that are resource constrained? And are there tensions between doing the right thing and making decisions that are essentially about resource constraint? And another question, which connects to your point, Rob, about structured process, is the link between these ideas and structured approaches to quality improvement. Are they a way of embedding an evidence-based approach to decision-making? Rob, do you want to respond?
Yeah, so Louella made a very interesting point there about not enough money, not enough time. And I think this is something I hear a lot. And it's quite interesting. You say, well, actually, if you haven't got much time, you haven't got much money, that is exactly the situation in which you should be doing evidence-based practice. That is it. If you've got loads of time, loads of money, do whatever you like. If you haven't got much time, much money, that's when you need it. Because, again, many of you can probably relate to this. How often do we spend implementing solutions to non-problems and having to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it and repeat? How much time does that waste? How much resources does that waste? So it's kind of interesting. But I mean, Laura's absolutely right. That's a comment. I don't have time for this. Well, yeah, fine. Then just waste money and waste time, if that's the alternative, So that's kind of interesting. And the point about quality improvement, yeah, again, I'm often asked this. So various quality improvement things, I think they are part of it, but typically they only maybe use a few sources of evidence or data. And it's much more after a decision, you're then seeing if the thing you've decided to do is kind of working or not. So it's more kind of on the evaluating, keep things on track idea. And crucially, you may have a great quality improvement system in place, but you actually haven't identified a real problem. So it's fine to have it, but I think it's crucially dependent on also having a framework for really being clear about what the problem opportunity is first.
Yeah. And Louella, one of the other questions someone's asked is about dealing with uncertainty, and so what scope there is for experimentation. And a couple of your examples were absolutely about experimentation, often in areas where you don't have an evidence base that's immediately to hand, or the application of that evidence base has a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity about it. So what scope is there in healthcare organisations to do, if you like, management experiments?
Yeah, so I find this absolutely fascinating because I think this is because one of the problems that we're increasingly coming up against is that if NICE and the colleges and NHSE and I are saying that X, Y, and Z must be done in this type of fashion, which I must say is almost always trialled in a much larger hospital than many hospitals. You know, there are a certain small number of hospitals which are repeatedly chosen for the pilot sites, and they are not rural DGHs, smaller rural DGHs in Cornwall. And I've just picked that out of the air. So that's the first problem we have, is that we're having big hospital solutions which are being applied blanketly regardless of the context, and there's all sorts of particular problems with that. But it also does drive certain types of expectations, and it also means that your ability to say that what we're really doing is genuinely innovative becomes much narrowed. And I think Rob is right, that if you're in a smaller organisation, then the driver is that you actually want to do that. But in fact, unless you've got what it was that the CQC or NHI or whoever it was who came to visit says that you didn't have, that's what you have to do. And I think then that the genuine innovation becomes, how is it that you can adapt that to do it better within your organisation that really fits in your organisational need, or are you going to be brave enough to push back against it, which kind of takes us back into the sort of realm of politics and how difficult these sorts of things are to do in the context of the NHS.
Yeah, but another question someone's raised is they say, well, I come to healthcare organisations with evidence, often quite high quality evidence, and what they say is, no, we need more evidence. Or they say, no, we need evidence that it works here rather than just it works elsewhere. And you hear that quite often about technologies that sit somewhere on the boundary between, you know, the clarity of a pharmaceutical and the complexity of a management intervention. They're somewhere in between the two, often, you know, devices that might be embedded in pathways. And you do hear people say, actually, the NHS uses evidence or a lack of evidence as an excuse for not adopting ideas and not adopting innovations. Comments?
Louella, do you want to go?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say it's the same kind of problem again. But I think one of the issues that we have is the failure that sits underneath this, is the failure to grapple with that fundamental underlying tension between understanding what has been presented, the way in which it was used, and is that enough to say that my organisation or the problem that we have is familiar enough, or is dissimilar enough to say that it might in fact actually use in this particular context. And I think that the failure to tackle that, I think, is really difficult. But again, at some levels, it's just an excuse to saying, well, we don't want to spend the money, or we don't want to, you know. In some levels, it's actually just an excuse. Because I think particularly with technology, we have to be quite careful with that, because technology almost means cost. And you have to be quite clear about whether the NHS does not spend to save money. And so I think that it becomes an excuse for cost constraint.
Yeah, I think sometimes that lack of evidence is used as kind of reasons to not do things. Sometimes that's for very, very, very good reasons. Sometimes it isn't so much. But I think what's interesting, a lot of the examples that have come up and in the questions as well so far, is they're all about doing stuff. Does this work better than that? What works? And I always think what works is a really strange question. It's the wrong question to start with. The question is, what's the problem? Or what's the opportunity? And I think one of the reasons people sometimes resist sort of innovations or new ideas is actually that they don't know whether it will work, not because they're different or they're special. They don't know enough about what the problem or issue is. So I often feel that if there's one thing people could do to be better at evidence-based practice, is spend more time saying what actually is in this organisation the problem or opportunity, and do that first before we start thinking about doing stuff. But the sort of temptation to do stuff is so strong. As I say, it's often what people are rewarded for. Yeah.
Doing stuff rather than making things. Yeah. Louella, a final comment from you, because I've got my eye on the time and it's 14:59. Anything you would like to add, particularly around that point about how we manage to get people to sometimes step back from the maelstrom of do, and get them to think?
Yeah, so I must say I've quite struggled with, you know, one of the interesting problems is how much we struggle with this in, as I said, you know, in most hospitals in the NHS, the staff don't have sufficient time in order to think about that. But I think we need to be thinking about how we teach people to better understand organisational and managerial constraints. And in some ways, it is just a circle, because that's what they used to do 10, 15 years ago before it was leadership and management. And I think that Rob's point about we don't understand the questions well enough, we are doing what we've been told to do or what someone down the road does. And I think that has to stop and really think about what is the need of our local patient population? What do the patients need? What do the patients look like? And how are we going to meet their need, not just now, but 5 to 10 years from now, when all the good stuff that we've done is put in place. And I think that managing the increasing number of external bodies and the pressures that these bring to bear is also quite problematic. And I don't know what the solution to that is, because it's not like every organisation delivers the quality of care that they ought.
Yeah. We're going to have to stop because of time, and it's a frustration, I think, because we've got 51 questions now, and every time I manage to cross one off, 2 more get asked on the Q&A. So my apologies to those whose questions haven't come up. We can continue the debate on Twitter, the hashtags HSRUK 2020, or on the website, on the comments page on the web pages. We will be trying to publish some blogs out of the conference as well. I thank you, Rob. Thank you, Louella. Your contributions have been brilliant, and thank you to everyone who's come and to the people who've asked questions. The first plenary tomorrow morning is at 10 a.m. British Summer Time. And it will be recorded and put on the website next week. It's on a crisis in adult social care, learning from across the UK. So please do come and join us for that. I hope you've enjoyed the session. We've had a great turnout. I hope we'll see you again tomorrow morning and tomorrow afternoon. So thank you everyone for coming, and goodbye.